Stop the world!
Welcome to Stop the World. I'm David Rowe.
And I'm Olivia Nelson.
Today's conversation boils down to one of the hottest topics in the world right now, which is data centers and the need for huge amounts of computing power to drive modern economies and societies. One way to access this computing power and also to store and manage your data is by buying cloud services, which are often provided by big tech firms known as hyperscalers.
And one of those hyperscalers is Microsoft. To talk about cloud computing and its strategic importance, we have Mike Yeh, the Regional Vice President for Microsoft's Corporate, External and Legal Affairs in Asia. Microsoft is a sponsor of ASPI's Sydney Dialogue, which is coming up on December 4 and 5. So it's great to have Mike here in the studio.
Yeah, it sure was. The data centers that provide the computing power for things like artificial intelligence are becoming key strategic assets for countries around the world. And in fact, countries and companies' fortunes might increasingly depend on how they manage these issues. So countries need to think about what having sovereignty over their data means, how they spread their risk around so they don't find themselves cut off from computing power, or even worse, cut off from their own data.
Mike covers all of these issues in a really accessible way. He talks about the energy demands of computing, the value of digitising and structuring all your data so you can use it more effectively, cloud computing and security, the questions a country like Ukraine faces in where and how to store its critical data, the concept of digital sovereignty, and the relationship between strategic competition and rival cloud services in the Indo-Pacific.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Mike is a smart and articulate guy, very thorough pleasure to deal with. And once you're done listening, folks, don't forget to check out the Sydney Dialogue website, which is tsd.aspi.org.au. Tickets are still available. Let's hear from Mike now. Mike Yeh from Microsoft. Welcome to Canberra. Thanks for coming on Stop the World.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So I want to start with a bit of an overview of what you do and your assessment of the region. Obviously, all countries in our part of the world are looking to digitize, looking to embrace AI. That includes Australia. We're an advanced economy, and yet we've got this sort of piddling productivity growth rate, which we're trying to solve in a number of ways, including through the integration and adoption of AI as one solution, but obviously Southeast Asian economies and Pacific economies as well that are still developing but looking to grow fast. So they're all looking to develop policies that encourage this, but do so in ways that are safe, secure, trusted, and enable them essentially to protect their own critical national data. Can you give me an overview of what you're seeing in the region at the moment in terms of trends on these policies, in terms of digital transformation and use of cloud, which you I know are very involved in? How do you see these evolving over the next, say, 5 years?
It's a great question.
Okay.
Let me see if I can do this in a minute or two. There's so many different aspects when I look across Asia and just what countries are doing. But I actually think the most interesting thing right now is to take a pause. Right? I think we've sort of been in this AI moment, I would say, for the last 2 years. I go back to the launch of ChatGPT. And I think it's worth slowing down and thinking about what can we learn from the last 2 years that should inform how we look forward. One of the things that is top of mind for me is energy. And so that's become, I think, a key priority for so many countries, especially as people start to grapple with the data center investments that are going in worldwide, the trillions of dollars that have been announced for AI data centers. I do think this is also an interesting place to make sure, as much as we talk about the geopolitics between the U.S. and China in particular, there are things that I think are worth looking at. What is China doing in this front? And so they've rolled out a policy called AI+. They did this a few months ago. And it's interesting because it's really focused on application. I think in many ways, there's an implicit acknowledgement that they may not catch up to the U.S. in terms of creating the most innovative, the biggest LLMs in the near term. And so they focus right now on figuring out how do they drive application of AI. And so AI Plus crosses a range of sectors. One of the most interesting ones for me is what they're doing in the energy space. And my summary of their plan is essentially energy for AI and AI for energy, right? And what China has done on the energy front, they're pretty openly agnostic about the type or form of energy that will be dominant in the future. What they see right now is that the demand for AI, for compute, will continue to grow in a way that outpaces the supply of energy. And so their whole approach is to figure out, all right, how do I get as much energy as I can online, build that infrastructure today, regardless of where it's from. And so you see them investing in all types of energy. And so I do think there's some insights and learnings there that the rest of the world would benefit from, right? As we think through that. The AI for energy piece is also really interesting. This goes back to me is like, how do you focus on applications, right? And so what China's doing is figuring out how do you apply AI to existing energy infrastructure to make it more efficient, right? And that's absolutely something that would be applicable here in Australia, right? How do you take the grid that exists today, but try to modernize it in small ways without actually completely overhauling or replacing it? So that's one learning. I just think about application, but think about energy, application of AI and think about energy. The second observation, as I look back on the last 3 years, every government talks about wanting to use AI, wanting to embrace AI. Every company is talking about that as well. What's interesting, I think, is in the last 2 years, many governments and companies have now come to the conclusion that they may actually not be ready to use AI. And one of the key learnings is in order to fully leverage AI, you really need structured data. The data needs to be digitized. I would argue it needs to be in the cloud. And many companies are just not at that point. And so one of the learnings, I think, and one of the calls to action is to start digitizing now. And it was great to see, I think it was the AI for public sector statement that came out today in Australia, talking about the importance of cloud adoption. But I think as basic as that sounds, that is the right foundational step.
Right. That's a lot. There's a lot in there. I definitely want to run with some of it and unpack some of it. Let's talk about the energy thing first. That's an interesting... I can completely see the logic of what you're talking about, that, let's just find cheap energy from all sources because we're going to need much more than we've currently got to power AI, which is going to solve a lot of the problems that we face in the future, including potentially, as you say, actually turning it into a cycle and using that AI then to produce energy efficiency, which is a lovely idea. But first of all, for a country like Australia that's committed to net zero, what does that actually mean for someone like us?
Look, I think there's still plenty of opportunities, even with a net zero commitment. And you look at what China's doing, quite frankly, even in the carbon-free green energy space, massive investments in that space. I think that their assumption is that actually will be the cheaper source of energy going forward, and so that is, I think that still leaves lots of opportunities for Australia to figure out what that looks like. Australia, is a country that has significant land resources. You have the space to figure out wind, solar, potentially thermal, in other forms, and so I don't think that precludes a strategy or precludes Australia from being net zero in the future.
Okay. You mentioned, I think at the start of your answer before, you mentioned just taking a breath and looking over the last 2 years. Do you mean that in a policy sense rather than, presumably adoption and integration we want to do as quickly as possible, but in a sort of sensible way? Just explain that a little bit further.
Yeah, I just think it feels like we should... I don't mean it from an actual pause in how we develop and how we use AI. This really is policy. That's not even a policy pause, I would say. This is as governments develop a strategy, it's just worth taking the time to look back and what are you learning from the first 2 years? And I think there's a lot, right? And you see, even from a regulatory perspective, the initial conversation was around, is AI going to be an existential threat to us? And then I think everyone used ChatGPT and realized probably not. And you can see that even that regulatory conversation has kind of, it peaked and then it has died down a little bit. I actually think we run the risk that we are not paying enough attention to what happens when AI becomes an existential threat to us. And so that probably is a conversation that should come back sooner rather than later, right?
Yeah, I listen very seriously to the catastrophic risk people because I think there is some logic to it. And while it might be in a minority chance rather than a majority chance, we're not going to have safe and trusted use of AI until we actually resolve those sorts of big issues to everyone's satisfaction, so that they are vanishingly unlikely, rather than sort of somewhere in the realm of 20 or 30%, which just seem like a risky situation. Tell me a little bit about this region, Asia, and that idea of structured data, and what they need to do and where they sort of need to get to in order to then be more AI ready than they are now, and actually just sort of harness it usefully for their economies.
Yeah. So some of it for me really is basic digitization, right? How do governments begin on that journey? And in some cases, they'll need to go back because the data is so important. How do you actually convert paper data to digital data so that you have full use, you have longitudinal data available to you? I think in some cases, though, we should be pragmatic. It's like, maybe we don't need to go back and completely digitize everything, but starting today, let's get this right. Let's think about the right data structures. And so I think that is, that's a digitization journey that the world has been on for about 10 years. But this might be the right catalyst to really force us to look seriously at how do we move that forward in a way that allows us to take advantage of AI more quickly in the future. I'll add one other thought on data, though. And this is a good example from Japan. And so one of the things Japan realized as soon as ChatGPT launched was the model really wasn't optimized for Japanese culture or language, right? And their response, I think, was the right one, which is, all right, how do we make more Japanese data available for training, right? And so thinking through that, I think there's also some intentionality there that is important for countries across this region, given the breadth of languages, but not just languages, right? But even culture. And Australia may sort of face that in a unique way, right? Where even though English is the dominant language, culturally, it can be very different from the way the rest of the internet is set up and represented.
Yeah. I mean, South Korea seems to be doing some interesting things there. They seem to have recognized that issue, and they've been working on their own models as a consequence. But you're saying that it needs a sort of top-down encouragement. Is that what you're saying?
I think the top-down helps. Like if I think about the Japan example, absolutely. You need government to be able to be intentional and figure out how do you make more Japanese data available. But I would also say, in terms of just the basic digitization, that can be done at a company level, at a department level, even within government. And so just getting people to really take action, to think, have that forward look. I think about the report that we just commissioned with with Mandela Partners that looked at IT spend in government. And I think they concluded that 85% of IT spend today is spent on legacy IT, updating legacy IT. Mm-hmm. And so I do think there's an opportunity to move that dial. Yep. It feels like in an ideal world, you want 15% focus on new IT spend to really get to like more than 50%, right? As you think about new technology and the pace of innovation. Getting from 15 to 50 seems like a long journey. There's a part of me that says, let's just try to double it, right? So how do you get from 15 to 30% in the next 3 years?
Tell me a little bit more about this idea of structuring and digitizing your data. Can you give me some examples? Just so, I mean, I suppose we're a general audience podcast for people who are interested in strategic policy and national security, but so not a technical audience per se. But are we just talking about things like, say, a mid-sized company taking its paper documents and putting them into digital form so that data is then structured that they can use, and somehow, sort of contribute that data?
I think, look, that's part of it. In our experience, one of the most useful applications for Microsoft Copilot within the company is just being able to navigate our company documents, right? And so in your scenario, just being able to digitize everything and being able to have AI basically grounded across all of your company documents so people can find HR policies, they can find the financial policies. There's definitely value there. But I also think about, I'll use healthcare as an example, right? The ability to take MRI images, right? Today, many of those are digitized already. But many of them just sit in separate files. Maybe it's a patient folder, that the clinic has organized. But figuring out how do you anonymize that data, how do you structure it, bring it together so it's easier to use AI to see patterns, right? To train AI so that it looks at the next MRI image and it can take the first run. I'm not suggesting a doctor doesn't need to be involved, but how do you train models by using anonymized data in a way that we don't do today?
That's a great example. So tell me then about this, the idea of sort of critical data and data that needs protecting. Obviously, we're talking about anonymized health records for very good reason. That's personal. That needs to be protected and secured. Tell me a little bit about how countries and how governments and how companies in this region are seeing this idea of critical data that they need to protect, that they need to work together, including with companies like Microsoft, to protect. And how is that evolving, that idea of critical data?
I think the idea of evolution is the right one. It's a conversation that has, again, come in different forms. I think in the initial reaction, and for many governments in the region, it is still their current reaction, which is they want data, whether it's critical or not. Many times there's just a desire for any government data to be stored in country, right? Or to be stored in a government data center. I think what the technology over time has also evolved. So people are increasingly recognizing that actually there are a lot of benefits to using cloud services. The most high profile example of some of the benefits actually came in the context of the Ukraine conflict, where Microsoft partnered with the Ukrainian government weeks before the attacks began to move some of the data for the Ukrainian government out of Ukraine, out of the government data center. What's interesting there is what we've also learned is that it turns out data centers can be literally big targets in a conflict. They're hard to hide. Russia knew exactly where the Ukrainian government data center was. And super clever strategy on Ukraine's part. It was like, why not move data from Ukraine into basically a NATO country? And then that creates all sorts of externalities that were helpful to Ukraine. I think this part of the world is also thinking about some of those lessons now and learning that. And so I think we are slowly, there's a conversation that is, I think with governments that is more, governments are more open to moving data outside for strategic reasons. And so I think that's a helpful conversation to have. The other idea that has come up recently is this idea of digital sovereignty. Everyone wants complete control, and it's similar to the location. I think it's a variant of that, maybe a more advanced version of the location requirement. And I think what's important for customers, for governments to recognize is that it's a trade-off, right? If you optimize for complete sovereignty, you're probably giving up some of the cost benefits, security benefits, and maybe innovation benefits that you would get from hyperscale cloud. One example of this that happened recently was there was a data center fire in Korea. It impacted the Korean government data center that powered the government cloud. One of the services impacted was called G Drive, essentially storage for government employees.
That sounds important.
Yes. It was the storage for 190,000 employees. And there were over 800 terabytes of data. And look, Korea went down this path because they wanted that sovereign solution, right? All run in Korea, completely controlled by the government. It turns out that data was not backed up. And actually, it's a little shocking, but I use the Apple iPhone analogy. I think, at least for me, and I think many other people, it's like we all buy a little bit of storage, but at some point the price is like just too much. And I'm like, whatever that incremental storage is, it's okay, I'll live with that risk. I think Korea got to that point. They just realized that with 800 terabytes of data, it would just cost so much money to keep backing it up. And so somebody made a decision not to back it up. They lost all that data. And so for me, the interesting question is, so did you really get sovereignty? Because it's really hard to have sovereignty if you don't have your data. And so just understanding that trade-off in terms of managing your own IT and the risks that may come with that.
So, okay, if you're expecting to be invaded, obviously there's a lot of merit in storing your data outside of your borders to mitigate against accidents and risks like a data center catching fire, or if you're not expecting to be invaded but you're within missile strike of a potentially rivalrous country, then that's going to be a problem as well. And presumably onshore data storage, I mean, somebody can break in, steal it, and then get out again using cyber-enabled techniques. So I start to see a picture emerging here of why something like secure cloud is beneficial across the board for different kind of strategic environments. But just explain to me, in lay terms, just tell me a little bit about the idea of secure cloud, how that works, and how does a country know that they can actually trust it, for instance, to store critical national data.
Well, let me start with how we think about the benefits. So the main driver for a lot of the benefits for hyperscale cloud today is all about economies of scale, right? So for Microsoft, for Amazon, for Google, we are all running global clouds. And so what that means, and security is a great example, we're able to invest billions of dollars into security, which is basically more than any individual customer could have invested on their own, right? The other advantage is because we have a global footprint, we're able to see signals from across our whole data set, right? So you may see a bad actor in one part of the world, but then we're quickly able to find ways to mitigate or to address that threat and then scale it out across our entire network. So even if you're not facing that particular threat here in Australia, but we detect it in Europe, you benefit from it, right? Similarly with some of the regulatory controls, like you think about European GDPR, many of those controls we've built for our European customers, but also for multinationals that do business there. And we've also gotten to the point now where we've just made those controls available. They've kind of become the de facto set of privacy controls. So those are all benefits that come from leveraging hyperscale cloud. On the technology side, same thing. I would say even if you look at GPUs today, the innovation continues very rapidly. But what we're able to offer you is we can always offer you the latest AI GPU. And we update that. You use what you need from us. And so that's the advantage versus, say, buying that GPU and being stuck with it for 5-10 years, whatever the time required is.
Right. Okay. So it's almost like it's like leasing or outsourcing in a way that means you've got the newest model all of the time.
Yeah.
Fascinating. And that goes to the point that, I mean, we sometimes think about cloud as data related, but in fact it's computing power related as well,
absolutely.
Isn't it? So just talk me through this sort of relationship, I guess, between, say, a company or country's data and its the compute that it wants to access in order to be able to drive its economy, an efficient economy, a digitized economy. And is there some? I mean, is there a complicated relationship between, say, your data and your compute access that enables you to sort of, bring all that stuff together and, achieve what you want to with your economy?
Yeah. I think your instincts are right on that. They can be separate. Right? Where do you put your data? And then what compute power do you access? I do think there are some common threads, though, where there are benefits to having the two in the same system or platform. And for me, it does come back down to cybersecurity, right? How do you secure the data when it's at rest? How do you secure it when it's in process, in transit, being used in the compute mechanisms? And so I do think there are synergies to bringing those ideas together. The obvious one is also latency, right? So thinking about ensuring that, for workloads where you need quick, immediate response, you need the data to be close to the compute.
Yep. Okay. So what does Asia as a region sort of need most in this space? I mean, do they need more data centers? Do they need more developed policies and legislation? Do they need harmonization across the region, especially among economic partners? What, in terms of sort of priorities, what would you say the key things that Asia needs right now?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would argue it needs more interoperability, just enabling cross-border data flows across this region. I'll use one example. As we think about the geopolitics of the region, and like I said, with the Ukraine case, many governments are realizing that they may want to put some data outside of their country. And just to use the three countries in East Asia, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, they all are open to putting data outside of their country. They don't have an obvious neighboring country to put it in, right? And so that's actually a really interesting conversation. I think that could be an opportunity for Australia as well, thinking about how do you build the resiliency, have the right infrastructure in place so that some of that data could be backed up in Australia, And so that could be an opportunity as well. But I think there's a sense of trust around the data flows. Southeast Asia is the same way, right? I look at Singapore and Malaysia. Malaysia has the data centers. I think Singapore would love to put more data into Malaysia, but figuring out what are the right trust mechanisms so that customers, whether they're in Singapore or elsewhere in the region, are comfortable putting data into Malaysia or into Australia. And this is where I think you see countries like Saudi Arabia start talking about the idea of creating a data embassy, right? How do you give people the assurance that it's safe to put their data here?
Right. So in terms of the opportunity for Australia, that's what we could be doing. What we need, what sort of legislation in place to create data embassies, for instance. That's what does Australia need to do?
Yeah. So I would say think about how do you create trust, right? And it could be legislation. I do think in some of these cases it could just be a bilateral government-to-government agreement. It's like, look, we're going to agree to put some data into Australia, and what I would expect from, for example, the government of Japan is to be able to say, we just need assurances that from a law enforcement access, you're not going to touch it, right? So it is sort of that embassy concept, but I think there are different ways to accomplish that and to provide the assurance that each country needs.
In Taiwan's case, I think we just wouldn't be allowed to call it an embassy. We'd have to call it a representative office or whatever.
Absolutely.
Data representative office. Now, strategic competition between US and China right now, obviously it's playing out in this part of the world in all sorts of ways. How are you seeing it play out in terms of, I suppose, the offerings that, say, the US hyperscalers are making to this part of the world versus the ones that China, via Huawei or whoever else is offering sort of cloud solutions to those countries? How is that sort of playing out?
Yeah, I think it depends. I would say where we see China most active in the region is in Southeast Asia. And that's where we see Alibaba expanding, building new data centers, Huawei as well, very engaged with governments in that part of the world. And so I do think there will be an opportunity for Microsoft to really differentiate, right? Thinking about how do we provide trusted technology solutions, provide the governance controls that I think many governments in this part of the world expect and want. And so I think there will be ways to differentiate. But we are definitely seeing a resurgence in the Chinese cloud providers, especially across Southeast Asia. We've seen some expansion in Korea as well, which gives you a sense of the markets they're targeting.
Right. Is it difficult for a country to use, say, Alibaba and Microsoft in a sense alongside each other? I mean, is there a sort of a zero-sum kind of competition here?
There may be a zero-sum competition, but the two are not exclusive, right? So especially at a country level, there could be plenty of workloads in Malaysia that are using Chinese tech, and at the same time, plenty of workloads that are using U.S. tech. Yep. So I think there will be room for both, but and some of it will just depend on what the workload is too. Obviously, I would hope that the more sensitive workloads end up on a more trusted platform.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I just want to circle back to something you mentioned before, and that was the advantage of having a large cloud provider, meaning that you are able to see cyber threats around the world and sort of and map those and learn from those, and then provide advantages to someone who might not have been hit yet. Can you give me an overview of what you are seeing on the cybersecurity side there? I mean, how new, how diverse are the sorts of threats that your threat assessment teams are picking up? Yeah. How much is AI being used to drive those new sort of cyber capabilities? What are you seeing there?
Yeah, so we put out a report every year. It's the Microsoft Digital Defense Report, and we try to summarize what we're seeing across the landscape. AI is definitely being used more frequently by bad actors in the space. The other dynamic that we are starting to see is there's definitely a sense that Russia, Iran, North Korea, and China are working together on cyber threats, on cyber attacks, and that's a red flag in many ways, because they all come to the table with different sets of expertise and experience, right? And so once they start comparing notes, they will be more powerful as a group and collectively. I do think that also creates pressure on democratically minded countries to figure out how do they work together better too, right? In this space. Something as basic as just figuring out how do we share cyber threat information. And this is another example. We've talked with the government in Japan, but also here in Australia, about how do we build systems. And in some ways, the idea is how do you create a national cybersecurity dashboard? But again, this kind of goes back to where we started the conversation. Mm-hmm. You have to start digitizing things. You have to get them set up into a cloud system. The reality is data is only going to grow exponentially. So how do you build systems that can scale? And then build a system that's interoperable, right? I don't think we're there yet, but you can quickly envision a world where Japan and South Korea, Australia would want to share cyber threat data with each other in real time. And so do we have the IT structures set up to enable that?
Absolutely. That's a great idea. I would endorse it fully, especially there's a lot of debate about how closely the sort of quartet of authoritarian nations is actually cooperating, how much of it is just sort of opportunistic or rhetorical, and how much of it is actually active. But I mean, if they are actually working together on cyber threats, you really want democratic countries to respond.
I would argue, even if they aren't working together.
Sure. It makes sense for us to work together. Absolutely. No, that makes a lot of sense. All right, we are running out of time. One last one, perhaps, to wrap things up. What do you see in societies around this part of the world in terms of, just trust in digitization, trust in AI? I mean, it seems to be fairly patchy. It sort of rises and falls according to different countries and different populations. But do you think that the sort of the trust building and people's readiness to adopt and embrace AI, including using all of the sort of the sort of technology means that we've talked about, is that heading in a positive direction, do you think?
Yeah. I think your word patchy is probably the right one.
Right.
I think it depends who you ask. It depends, I think about whether it's an enterprise customer, but even consumer, and then I would break it down by age, even among consumers. It is interesting. I do think, I've participated in a few roundtables recently with young people talking about AI, how they think about it from a career perspective, education context. And that's where I really sense that it is patchy. The anecdotes I've heard is that some schools literally just in the last year have changed policies from like, don't use AI to look, you have to use AI. And so I think students feel that whiplash. The other thing is I actually think we need to think through, and Australia is a great place to have this conversation as it kind of leads the world on the social media ban. But I think social media is a great example where I think we see a lot of bad AI being used. I think there's increasingly a sense that you think about videos today on social media, no one really knows what's AI generated anymore. And so figuring out how do we create trust in that product where people don't think of it as just AI slop, but actually it's AI that adds value. It's AI that I want to see and I want to kind of consume. And so I think it's a mixed bag right now. But I think that also means that there's work that we need to do as a society.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I presume broadly speaking, that the younger a person is, the more they're likely to embrace and trust AI. Perhaps that isn't perfect, but I certainly hear what you're saying about the whiplash that a lot of young people might be feeling. Last year it might have been cheating. This year it is, learning to use it as a tool effectively. Fascinating.
Yeah. So in the workplace, we fully embraced it. But I also think everyone now is figuring out, all right, what's the next wave? Where do we really see the application beyond generative AI between ChatGPT or Microsoft Copilot? And so I think that'll be an interesting time, but I also think that's where opportunity is created, not just for Australia, but for every country in Asia.
Yep. All right, terrific. All right, Mike Yeh, thanks so much for coming on Stop the World. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
That's all we have time for today, folks. Thanks for listening to Stop the World. We'll be back with another episode soon.